Glenn Turner was returning home early in the morning after a long shift at the hospital. He was eager to get some rest. However, he was also excited about some news that he couldn't wait to share with his wife, Alexa. Married for 8 years, their relationship was built on trust and mutual support. He was confident that Alexa would be thrilled with his news. Hearing the key in the lock, Alexa came out to greet him and kissed. "Hi, dear. How are you? You seem mysterious," the woman said. She went to the kitchen and started preparing a hearty breakfast, waiting for Glenn's explanation. "I've been offered a position at the Med Expert Clinic," Glenn announced. "Wow! Is that the clinic your former department head opened?" "That's the one. Can you believe it? Dr. Hammond called me today. I feel so uplifted." "Glenn, that's fantastic. You deserve this. He wouldn't just call anyone into his business. He must strongly value you as a specialist." "I was the best at the academy," shrugged Glenn. Glenn didn't doubt himself, but he was still in disbelief about his good fortune. The salary of a city hospital worker vastly differed from that of a clinic doctor. However, what truly attracted Glenn to working at Med Expert was the chance to conduct his own medical research, thanks to the funding from various sponsors. "You have to accept it. You deserve it. Just think about the opportunities that will open up for you. At the hospital, the management is stifling you. There's no growth." "But Oliver is also there," Glenn reminded his wife softly. Glenn had been friends with Oliver since their days at the medical academy, but they had quickly become foes. Glenn was a kind soul who rarely spoke ill of others and always attempted to understand their actions. On the other hand, Oliver was outspoken about his displeasure and never avoided being mean. "Well, let it be," Alexa carelessly dismissed with a wave of her hand. Without uttering a word, Glenn hugged his wife. "Thank you, my love, for always believing in me." The woman smiled happily and hugged him back, reassuring him, "You will succeed. Don't even think of doubting yourself." After a few hours of sleep, Glenn woke up and without wasting much time, he called his former supervisor. "So, my dear, do you agree?" Dr. Hammond's coarse voice came through the phone. "Of course, Dr. Hammond. I'm ready to work for the good of mankind in your clinic." Glenn responded cheerfully, "But I'll have to fulfill my obligation at the hospital first." I see. It's very difficult to find a good surgeon these days. I've known your head doctor for a long time, so I won't push. Let him find you a good replacement." Glenn was encouraged by Alexa's support and her faith in his professional success. Even the presence of her husband's rival in the form of a former friend did not shake her faith in him. She was firmly convinced her talented husband would save numerous lives. At his new place of work, Glenn was continuously astounded by the pricey equipment, which he had only dreamt of before. He was also pleased with the organization of the work process and the full staff of medical personnel. "Hey, you!" Somebody addressed Glenn on his first workday. He immediately recognized that voice. "Who gave you that uniform?" "Hello, Oliver," Glenn replied discreetly, not responding to the man's comment. "And it's you. I mistook you for an orderly. I see someone unfamiliar is walking around. So Dr. Hammond also dragged you here." "Well, you're not the only one from our graduating class to glorify the name of our academy. I have to go. I'll see you around sometime." Glenn breathed a sigh of relief, grateful that Oliver hadn't upset him with a foolish prank. He was always trying to humiliate his opponents or ridicule them. Glenn once enjoyed such pranks, but he had matured since then. Glenn was fully consumed by his job at Med Expert Clinic. He appreciated that his wife had chosen to become a housewife because he was too exhausted to do anything else after his shifts at work. The initial months at his new job were challenging. His colleagues were not exactly welcoming, and he had to earn their trust and the nurses' respect. And of course, Oliver made things even more difficult by often recounting incidents from their residency in which Glenn appeared inept. Meanwhile, Glenn was so engrossed in his professional issues that he failed to notice Alexa and the changes in her mood. But one day he realized that something was off about her. She would drop things, bump into furniture, or just stand thoughtfully in the middle of a room. "Something's bothering you." Glenn moved away from the couch to approach her. "Alexa, are you okay?" "I want a divorce," she said softly, and Glenn didn't immediately make out the words. "What?" "I want a divorce. We need a divorce." "What are you talking about?" he asked in confusion. "I'm infertile, Glenn. Infertile. How many years have we been trying to conceive a child? I've had a checkup, and it's not possible. I can't give you a child, and without that, there can be no marriage. You'll be unhappy with me, and you'll end up hating me." "Oh, dear, you scared me so much," Glenn replied, clutching his forehead. "Why so drastic? Silly." He hugged Alexa. "We love each other. That's the main thing. If we can't have our own child, we can adopt." "Really?" Alexa asked through her tears. "Of course, honey. Come here. You've been torturing yourself for months in vain. You can always count on me. Always. We're a family. Don't be afraid to discuss important things with me." Glenn had dreamt of becoming a father, but he hadn't realized how much their struggles had affected his wife. She had never complained about wanting to become a mother immediately. To cheer her up, he proposed that they contact the local orphanage and meet some children. And so they did. "Isn't she wonderful?" Alexa asked, her face lighting up with a smile as she watched her husband look at 3-year-old Kira. The couple was charmed by her ringing laughter and blonde curls. "Really?" Glenn agreed. The adoption went smoothly. A promising surgeon and his wife were deemed excellent potential parents for the little one, who was abandoned in infancy by her indifferent parents. "Who's there?" "Daddy!" Alexa cheerfully shrieked, greeting her husband in the hallway with their daughter in her arms. "Daddy!" the girl repeated after her mum, reaching her arms towards Glenn. "Hello, my princess." Glenn easily picked up Kira and kissed his wife. "Hi, my queen. So, what have you been up to?" "We made soup for lunch, went to the playground. Kira made a friend, didn't you, sunshine?" Alexa affectionately stroked the little girl's fluffy hair. Glenn couldn't help but admit that Alexa was a wonderful mum. She was attentive, caring, and still managed to carry out her usual routine, even after looking after an active child. Alexa never neglected Kira's needs and always made time for her. Glenn hoped that his wife would finally change and regain the sparkle in her eyes. But even adoption didn't help. Alexa dutifully did everything expected of her, but Glenn started to think she was unhappy. He suspected she might be suffering from depression, and that their sudden new role as parents couldn't heal her. "Why don't we go to the Philharmonic concert on Friday? We could hire a babysitter for the day and then visit your favourite restaurant. We haven't had a night out in a while. I think it would be good for you," he suggested after dinner. "If there is anything you need, just let me know. I can see how hard you're working to be a good mother to Kira." "Thanks, honey. I really haven't been out in a while," Alexa replied, without much enthusiasm. During the weekend, Glenn tried to spend more time with his wife and daughter. He struggled to find a way to discuss Alexa's condition and offer her support. For 6 months, the family lived in this rhythm. Glenn thought Alexa seemed more active and cheerful. They started going out more often, leaving Kira with a nanny. Glenn assumed things were improving, and he had nothing to worry about. However, one day after a long surgery, he received a call from an unfamiliar number that unsettled him. "Mr. Turner, your wife's car was found in the river. Divers are searching for her, but the chances of survival are minor." "Wait, what? What are you saying?" Glenn was utterly confused. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What kind of sick joke is this?" "I'm sorry, but it's not a joke. We can't provide any definite answers right now. You'll have to wait until the search is complete." Unable to think of anything Glenn started calling Alexa, but all was to no avail. So he drove home, hoping that he would find his wife unharmed there. But he found only Kira and her nanny there. "Where could she have gone?" Glenn asked the woman. "I don't know, Mr. Turner. She left after lunch and never returned," the nanny replied, holding the little Kira in her arms. My God, what could happen? For the following days, Glenn was in a state of shock. He barely managed to take a few days off to process the situation. The constant worry was overwhelming. The divers concluded their search for Alexa's body without finding it. "Why did you call off the search?" Glenn argued, running along the riverbank. "She couldn't have just vanished. You need to find her body. Otherwise I won't believe it." "Mr. Turner, we understand your grief, but our resources are limited. We have other tasks to attend to." "I don't care. I need to find my wife. She could still be alive. She might have managed to get out on her own." "But don't you think she would have contacted you if she was still alive?" Accustomed to looking at the world through the prism of logic, Glenn could not get it into his head that his wife had disappeared without a trace. He knew that her survival, even if she escaped the flooded car, seemed improbable, given the icy cold water and the strong current. It was late fall. The river must have swept Alexa away. These things happen, and the families of victims must come to terms with their loss. "What about that woman?" Glenn insisted. The investigation had revealed that Alexa had picked up somewhere an unkempt elderly woman, and that they were seen on the security cameras before Alexa's car got into the river. It was unclear if this mystery woman had left the car before the accident. What if she's the one to be responsible for the accident? Alexa rarely lets strangers get into her car. Surely it was that woman who did something bad to my wife, Glenn reasoned. "Mr. Turner, please calm down. We're doing everything possible to find your wife," the officer reassured him. "The security camera footage isn't clear, but we've enhanced the image of the unknown woman and shared it with all departments. Volunteers are assisting too, searching the streets and speaking with the homeless." Glenn spent all his weekends trying to find Jane Doe. He believed she would know the answers to all his questions. No matter how hard he tried, no one on the street could identify her. As time wore on, Glenn began to lose hope, especially as the police seemed to reduce their active pursuit of the case. "Glenn, I'm very sorry about Alexa," Dr. Hammond said to him. "I'm a widower myself. I know how you feel." "Alexa's not dead," Glenn immediately responded. All right. I didn't mean to upset you. I'm here to offer you any help you need. You're like a son to me, but now you have a daughter. You can't remain despondent all the time. She needs a reliable, attentive parent. Think about the impact your state will have on your daughter." "You're right," Glenn agreed quietly, a lone tear escaping. "Alexa would never neglect Kira, and I've completely given up. I have to become the best dad too, if Alexa doesn't come back." Glenn had to accept that their family now consisted of just 2 people. Gradually, he was able to smile at his daughter again, fulfilling the roles of both parents. "Daddy, I love you," the little girl murmured before bedtime, giving Glenn the strength to keep going. "I love you too. Now, go to sleep." The everyday life of a single father was more complex than Glenn had anticipated. Thanks to his position at the clinic, he was able to enroll Kira in a daycare centre for employees' children. This allowed him to always be there for his daughter, confident that she was in good hands. In a short time, he had learned how to dress her properly and braid her hair, so she would be comfortable throughout the day. "Spending time with my daughter rejuvenates me after hours of surgery. It's as if she's healing me," Glenn thought to himself occasionally. Time flew by, and soon Glenn escorted Kira to school for the first time. "You look so beautiful," Glenn exclaimed, admiring his formally dressed daughter. Kira's 2 long blonde braids were lovely, and her blue school uniform made her look slightly older. "I can't wait to meet everyone," the little girl exclaimed. Kira was well prepared for school and could share many interesting stories about life in the clinic with her classmates. She spent most of her free time there. Kira was thrilled with her first classes, fascinated by how different they were from kindergarten. The girl went to school on her own. Glenn was not afraid of her and even proud of his daughter's independence. The school was only a few minutes' walk away, and Glenn walked the route with Kira beforehand so that it was fixed in the girl's head. "The main thing is to cross the road in the right place and look right and left," Kira repeated to assure her father that she remembered everything. "And after school, go straight home, don't detour." "Good girl." Glenn kissed Kira. On a rainy day, Kira noticed a strange elderly woman standing under the store's canopy. She had an umbrella, but the woman was clearly wet and cold. Known for her kindness, Kira couldn't ignore her plight. "Hello, are you cold?" Kira asked, mustering her courage. "Hello, dear. It's nothing. I'm a bit wet, but I'll dry off soon," Mrs. Mathis replied, too embarrassed to admit her homeless state to this little girl. Most children believe that a successful future awaits them, a good job, a new home, a family, and other achievements. However, it's possible for someone to lose everything instantly and struggle to recover. "I invite you to my home. We can have tea and you can warm up a little." "Oh, no, dear. Your parents might not appreciate a guest like me." "It's all right. Daddy won't be home for a few hours. Let's keep this our little secret," insisted Kira. Mrs. Mathis wanted to refuse, but the temptation was too great. Her worn-out coat, which she had used for years, had no place to dry. While she was largely unnoticed by others, a little girl named Kira saw her differently. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll accept your offer, but only for a bit. I don't want to cause any trouble for you," Mrs. Mathis replied, following Kira. Kira led her to the newly built buildings with gorgeous entrances. Inside, the hallways were expansive, decorated with pictures and large pots of well-maintained indoor plants. "What a lovely place," Mrs. Mathis declared upon stepping into Kira's apartment. "My daddy is a surgeon," Kira proudly shared, guiding Mrs. Mathis around. "You can wash your hands here and hang your coat on the heater to dry it faster." Mrs. Mathis felt a bit strange being looked after by the 7-year-old Kira, chattering constantly, laid out snacks and sweets on the table. She was attentive to her guests and did not let them get bored. Nevertheless, Mrs. Mathis kept a wary eye on the entrance, apprehensive about the apartment's owner return. Her gut told her that the man would kick her out immediately or call the police. "Don't worry. If Daddy comes back, I won't give you away," Kira promised sincerely. Mrs. Mathis could see her sincerity, but it offered little comfort. A few minutes of warmth had cost her a great deal of anxiety. "It's like a game. Dad won't find out about anything." But suddenly the front door opened, and Kira froze in horror. Glenn had returned earlier than expected, a surprise to everyone. "Get up quickly," the little girl whispered, leading Mrs. Mathis into the spacious closet. "Sit here quietly. I'll let you out soon." "Hi, Daddy." Kira leapt into her father's arms, and he lifted her off the floor. "You're early today." "The scheduled surgery was cancelled, and Dr. Hammond told me to go home to my daughter. What have you been up to?" "I was eating. I just got here." Glenn spotted 2 cups of tea in the kitchen and immediately asked his daughter, "Do we have guests?" "A classmate was here," Kira quickly lied, worried about her mistake. Even though her dad was a kind man who saved lives, he didn't allow her to talk to strangers, much less take them to his apartment. After hanging his jacket in the hallway, he noticed a shoe print that clearly did not belong to a child. "Kira, what is this? Who visited us?" Kira knew she couldn't lie any more. Overcome with guilt for trying to deceive him, her face turned red and tears streamed down her cheeks. "Daddy, please don't kick her out, she's good," Kira pleaded, clinging to her father's waist to keep him from moving. "Well, what are you hiding from me?" "Grandma doesn't have a place to live. I brought her here on my own initiative. She didn't force me." Glenn froze as he opened the closet room door. The woman he had been searching for months was staring right at him. It was the same woman who had been in Alexa's car that fateful day, and then vanished as if she had never been there. "You!" Glenn exclaimed, taken aback. "Are you tormenting my family? First, my wife drowned because of you. Now, you're after my daughter?" "What are you talking about? I don't understand what you're accusing me of," responded the scared guest, hoping to exit the apartment as swiftly as possible. She didn't want any trouble or involvement from law enforcement. She regretted 100 times that she had agreed to the offer of the kind-hearted girl. "4 years ago, you got into the car with my wife." Glenn pulled out a printed photo of Mrs. Mathis from his office drawer, taken from that very video camera, and shoved it in her face. "Isn't this you?" "Yes, what's the issue?" The elderly woman looked perplexed now. "You were the last person seen alive with my spouse that day. After that, her car plunged into the river off a bridge. Her body was never found. I spent a considerable amount of time searching for you, thinking you might know something, that you could help me. Alexa's death remains a mystery to our family. No one could explain why she was in that part of town or why she picked you up." Mrs. Mathis began to cry, understanding that she had become entangled in a complex and distressing story. "Please forgive me, but I barely remember what happened. It was the first and the last time I met your wife. Please accept my condolences. I was unaware that such a tragedy would befall her. We had been driving together for about 20 minutes. I was cold, so I hitched a ride to the shelter where I spent the night. I don't know anything beyond that." "No? You must know something." Glenn refused to believe her. "You might have heard or noticed something. Only you can reveal what the investigation couldn't. I was hoping you could shed some light on my wife's death. The police suggested it might have been suicide, but that seems unlikely. Alexa desperately wanted a child, and we had Kira." Glenn glanced affectionately at his daughter, who was standing in the doorway, listening to the adults converse. "I swear to you, I know nothing. I didn't harm your wife. May her soul rest in peace. We met by chance. I just happened to be in the right place, and we said goodbye. She definitely didn't seem able to harm herself," Mrs. Mathis explained. "How can you be so sure?" Glenn asked, giving her a tense stare. "Isn't your name Oliver?" Mrs. Mathis inquired, which only confused Glenn. "No. Why?" "She called someone, and called him affectionately Oliver. I immediately assumed he was someone special to her. They only talked for a couple of minutes, but your wife seemed perfectly content. She had a playful tone, and they were discussing an upcoming meeting, so it's unlikely she was planning to commit anything terrible." "She didn't know any Oliver!" Glenn yelled, pounding his fist on the wall. "Daddy!" Kira cried out, causing her father to immediately quiet down. "Honey, go to your room. You don't need to hear this," he told her. Glenn realized that the mysterious stranger with whom Alexa had been speaking during their last encounter was someone connected to her secret life. But how? Glenn had never heard his wife mention this name before. What was she hiding from him? Why had she left home that day? He needed time to unravel these troubling questions. "I'm sorry for yelling at you," he said, looking at Mrs. Mathis. "As winter approaches, where do you plan to stay?" "This isn't my first year living on the streets." The elderly woman waved it off. She was always embarrassed to tell how she had to wander around looking for warm shelter. "Kira would never forgive me if I let you live in this weather. It's raining and the wind is biting. Stay with us tonight." Before going to bed, Glenn thought about Mrs. Mathis. Kira had quickly become friendly with her, and Mrs. Mathis herself seemed pleasant. She didn't smell of cigarettes or alcohol, and although she roamed the city, she didn't appear dangerous. Glenn had needed a new assistant since the last one went on maternity leave. He couldn't keep the apartment clean due to lack of time, and he didn't want to impose adult responsibilities on Kira, thereby depriving her of her childhood. "Mrs. Mathis," he approached the guest the next morning, "I have an offer for you. I need a housekeeper. Would you be interested in the job? You can live here and I'll ensure your pay is fair. Kira is often bored when she's alone. She likes you." "My God," Mrs. Mathis exclaimed, placing one hand on her face and the other on her heart. "Are you serious?" Yes. There's no need to cry. I'm sincere. There's no catch. It's a win-win situation. It seems both Kira and I need you." "Thank you. You are indeed a kind-hearted man." Glenn provided Mrs. Mathis with money for essential cleaning supplies, household chemicals, and comfortable new clothes. "Don't be shy. Choose what you like. I'll buy the groceries myself. You just need to write me a list for the week," the man said, seeing the sincere gratitude in Mrs. Mathis's eyes. "I will, Glenn." With Mrs. Mathis's arrival, the apartment seemed to regain its soul. Kira was no longer bored in front of the TV waiting for her dad. With Mrs. Mathis, she started going on walks, shopping, and learning to cook simple dishes. Mrs. Mathis, having been a teacher in the past, easily engaged the obedient Kira in her tasks. Glenn was delighted with the new-found coziness, delicious food, and knowing that his daughter was always supervised by an adult. However, he couldn't shake off the name Oliver from his mind. But who was this Oliver? How could he be found? Glenn wasn't sure, but he wasn't going to give up. One day he was having lunch in the clinic. Oliver sat at the neighbouring table. He opened a container he'd brought from home and released a familiar scent that immediately reminded Glenn of Alexa. "Is it supposed to smell like that?" Glenn laughed, recalling a past moment when his fiancée had tried to surprise him with her cooking skills. "Shut up, honey. I accidentally mixed up the seasonings and poured the wrong ones into the pot," Alexa confessed in a pitiful tone, embarrassed by her mistake. "Doesn't sound bad to me," Glenn replied with a mouthful of food. "Let this be your signature recipe. I'm serious, these seasonings work even better. It seems like you're the first to discover this." Alexa smiled and hugged her lover. Reminiscing this scene, Glenn struggled to keep calm and not immediately confront Oliver for an explanation. He knew something for sure, and it was not for nothing that he had been looking at him strangely lately. Glenn felt his colleague's disdainful attitude and mocking glances, as if Oliver knew some secret. Asking Oliver directly for the truth seemed like a bad idea. Glenn knew Oliver would remain silent out of spite, simply to make things more difficult. "Dr. Hammond," he turned to his boss, "may I leave early today? There are no scheduled or urgent tasks." "What's the matter?" "Two surgeons are fleeing from me today," he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in frustration. "They're urgently calling for me at school." "All right, go. We'll manage somehow." Glenn managed to leave at the same time as Oliver. Curious about his actions, Glenn decided to follow him. The pursuit led the man to a supermarket. He didn't dare to follow Oliver inside. It would be suspicious if he saw him in this neighbourhood where they had never crossed paths before. What Glenn saw next literally nailed him to the seat of his car. Oliver came out of the store holding the hands of two little twins, and next to them came a woman with a stroller. It was Alexa. She had the same hair, same face, and same gait. Glenn did not know how to react. It was impossible. Is Alexa alive? Is she the mother of Oliver's children? How could this be? Resisting the urge to confront them in the middle of the street, he waited until the whole family got into Oliver's SUV and drove up to a one-story house behind a secure fence. At this point, Glenn's patience ran out. He approached the couple as they were helping the children out of the car. "That's how it is," he said loudly, and the woman shuddered. "Alexa, why did you do this to me? I couldn't find peace. I've been searching for you all this time. How could you leave me like that? You're a monster." "Okay, calm down," Oliver intervened, pushing him away from Alexa. "Don't touch her. Alexa, take the kids and go home. I'll handle this." "No, she stays," Glenn demanded. "I want an explanation. No one is leaving." "I'm sorry, Glenn. It was necessary," Alexa replied, holding her children closely. "You said you were infertile," Glenn exclaimed in disbelief. "What did I do to deserve this?" "Don't talk to her," Oliver threatened. "There's nothing to discuss now. Forget her and let us live in peace. We've been in love for a long time, but my career would have been over if Alexa had just left you for me. You're close with Dr. Hammond. I knew he'd side with you and kick me out of the clinic. It's not a good idea to argue with people like him. I wouldn't have been able to get a decent job anywhere with him against me. That upright man has a keen sense of morality. And instead of making an honest confession, you've made a spectacle of it. You're both just inhuman. You are worth each other," Glenn muttered through clenched teeth. He despised Oliver and was ready to lash out, but his disappointment in Alexa was boundless. "I don't believe I ever loved you. It's a good thing we're not together anymore. I wouldn't want a woman like you raising my daughter." "Glenn, listen." Alexa approached him, tears welling in her eyes. "I know you've been through hell." "What do you know? I lived in hope that you were alive. I refused to believe you were dead. When there is hope, the heart cannot rest. I exhausted myself, thinking that one day you'd ring the doorbell and we'd be a family again. And by the way, consider it revenge on you." Oliver interjected with a snide tone. He felt no remorse, unlike Alexa. He was indifferent to others' grief and heartache. He only sought what was best for himself, regardless of the cost. "Remember our third year at the academy, when you dated Helena? She chose you, even though I saw her first." "Are you serious? We dated for only 4 months and she moved to the other side of the country." "You don't forget things like that," Oliver responded, still nursing past grievances. "Why are you complaining? You have a daughter. We thought of a way to ease your loss of Alexa. You found comfort in her." "I feel sorry for your children because they have such ugly genes," Glenn replied. "Glenn, forgive me. I didn't want you to suffer like this. You never hurt me, but I was unhappy." "And for that reason you made me and our daughter unhappy. Thank you for such generosity," the man snapped back. "You'll never understand what we went through. It was difficult to accept your death. You adopted a girl and then just vanished. Didn't she dream of having a mother? Didn't she deserve one? You used her and ran away." Alexa cried loudly, and Glenn turned and walked to his car. He reached his home with a clouded mind. He did not report his wife's scam to the police, although he was tempted to seek revenge. He left it to God's judgment. "Glenn, what's going on?" Mrs. Mathis asked him when she heard a noise in the hallway. "My God, you look awful. It's as if you've been run over by a truck." "I'd like to be alone. Did you put Kira to bed?" he asked, heading to the bar to get a bottle of cognac. "Don't worry, I've taken care of it. We have the lessons ready. Maybe we can come up with something for an appetizer," she asked excitedly. Mrs. Mathis had never seen Glenn in such a state and couldn't imagine what had upset him. "No, you shouldn't. Don't worry about me. Good night." Glenn was deeply hurt by Alexa's betrayal. It would have been easier to believe that she was no longer alive, preserving her kind image in his memories. But now she seemed like a callous woman, ready to do whatever it took for her own gain. Glenn's turmoil started to affect his professional life. Although he maintained good relations with his colleagues and patients, his usual spark was missing. He became consumed by his personal problems, neglecting the scientific research he had planned to conduct with his interns. His students were talented, but he lacked the drive to motivate them in their scientific endeavours. "Glenn, you're heading down a destructive path," Mrs. Mathis warned, shaking her head. "Let her go. Forgive her. Carrying such a weight is unnecessary. I can see it's hurting you." "How can I forgive someone who did what she did? I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy." "Look at it this way. Now you're free from someone unreliable. If Alexa is capable of such acts, why stay with her? She could have stayed with you, mothering Kira, and you would never have known how rotten she was inside. God took her away from you. It's a sign. Don't despair. You have everything you need to be happy. A roof over your head, a profession that feeds you, a wonderful daughter." "You're right, Mrs. Mathis, but I'm not ready to let it go yet. I'm too angry. You know, I've also been through terrible things. Maybe my story will make you think, and you'll start to appreciate what you have," Mrs. Mathis said, finally deciding to share something personal. "My daughter Samantha left home at the age of 19. She was a student. She fell in love with a biker. Her father and I disapproved of their relationship. Dennis was a bad influence on her and strained her nerves." Mrs. Mathis sighed sadly, remembering her daughter's vibrant persona. "We forbade them from seeing each other, but did they listen? I begged and cried, but Samantha thought Dennis was the love of her life. He wasn't stable. He moved from town to town. All he had was a motorcycle and the occasional part-time job. He had nothing to offer my daughter, but she ran off with him anyway. We kept in touch by phone for a while. She occasionally texted, assuring me not to worry. But one day, the messages stopped. Since then, we've heard nothing from our Samantha." Mrs. Mathis sobbed, no longer able to hold back her tears. "And you still don't know where she is?" Glenn asked, sincerely perplexed. "Until now, there hasn't been a day that I haven't thought of my daughter. Besides pictures, I have nothing left of her. My spouse couldn't bear the loss and drowned his sorrows in alcohol. He couldn't overcome his grief. I tried to reason with him, but he stubbornly clung to his oblivion. Soon he died." "I'm so sorry," Glenn said, attempting to comfort the elderly woman, but she hadn't finished her story yet. "You never asked me how I ended up on the streets. Thank you for your tact, but I suppose it's time I told you. After my family had ruined, I was devastated. I didn't know whether my daughter was alive or not, but I held on to the hope that she might return. Then I met a young woman with a baby in her arms at the market. She was begging for alms. We started talking. She had run away from her abusive husband. She had no money, no belongings, no home. Her whole family had disowned her when she got married, so she had nowhere to go. The thought that My Samantha could also end up in a strange city without a reliable husband and without means of subsistence moved me. So I let Lauren and her baby stay with me. I didn't mind sharing my home with a single mother because I was alone. Besides, it was unbearable to be in an empty apartment. Their arrival brought life back into my world. Then Lonnie, her alleged brother, arrived. According to their story, he had long desired to extricate his sister from her abusive marriage, but he had no place of his own. I allowed him to stay so Lauren wouldn't worry. She felt safe with him because she feared her husband would find her. Eventually, these scoundrels turned out to be scammers, and they forced me to sign documents transferring the apartment to their use. They threatened me, starved me for days, and kept me in their sights so that I couldn't complain to anyone. Lonnie threatened me with a knife, and I gave in. After they got my signature on the papers, they threw me out on the street. That's how I became homeless. That's horrific. Why didn't you report them to the police? I did, but to no avail. I couldn't prove that I was forced to sign the papers. By law, they became the apartment owners. If there had been a single witness to this violence, I might have stood a chance. As it was, everyone attested that I was close to Lauren, almost considering her my own daughter. It's difficult to believe that such injustice exists in our era. Glenn shook his head. I'm extremely grateful for your empathy. No one has shown me kindness in a long time. They deemed me a beggar and a layabout. Who would need me at my age? They only hire young girls now, and no one would let me work with children. You know, Mrs. Mathis, not only did I help you, but you also helped me. Kira is very fond of you, and even calls you grandmother. My relatives live far away. We rarely see each other, and she yearns for the company of loving people. You're a great dad. Don't you dare doubt it. Kira is very lucky to have you. She may have a bad mother, but her father is one in a million. Over time, Glenn became increasingly troubled by Mrs. Mathis's daughter's story. He yearned to uncover what had happened to her. After speaking with the elderly woman again, and meticulously recording every detail, he turned to a private detective. I'm counting on you very much. Glenn firmly shook the detective's hand after discussing the topic. You can count on me. The case is not that complicated. I think I can solve it in about a week at most. Filled with hope, Glenn awaited the detective's findings. Soon, the detective called and arranged a meeting, asking Glenn to bring both his daughter and Mrs. Mathis. This is Archie Bennett, the private detective. Mrs. Mathis, I hired him to shed some light on where your daughter disappeared to, said Glenn, while everyone was seated in the cafe the following day. You have decided to use my services for a good reason, the detective confirmed, his interest piqued by the situation. Good afternoon, ladies. Glenn, during my investigation, I discovered that Mrs. Mathis and Kira are grandmother and granddaughter. Samantha gave birth to Kira from Dennis. They separated long before the girl was born, and Samantha tragically died in childbirth due to complications. Please accept my sincere condolences. Since the hospital staff had no contact with Samantha's relatives, Kira was placed in an orphanage, where she lived until Glenn and Alexa adopted her. Mrs. Mathis, I have located your daughter's grave. You can visit her. It's not far, just in the neighbouring town. My daughter was so close all this time, and I didn't even sense it. Mrs. Mathis sobbed. She was all alone. She was terrified. The man abandoned her. Samantha, my darling, I'm sorry, my girl. If only I knew where you were, I'd bring you home. I talked to her entourage, Archie continued, once again drawing attention to himself. He was used to people's reactions like this and could keep his emotions down by now. He had to get the job done before the end. All of Samantha's friends spoke highly of her and you. They said she always spoke well of her family and missed you a lot. She loved you. She was too scared to come home pregnant. She felt guilty for not heeding your warning about Dennis, and was too ashamed to face you after she left.
We would have welcomed her back. We would have helped. A child is always a blessing. Kira, you're my true granddaughter. God, I'm so relieved.
It took a while for the three of them to recover from the shock of the sudden news. A few more months went by, and the family slowly got used to the shocking news from the past. One day, Glenn came to a meeting and could not believe his eyes when he saw the new co-worker of the clinic. "Helena, how did you get here?" "Hello," she said quietly, trying not to draw the attention of her new co-workers. "I'm back in my native land." Glenn immediately noticed that Helena did not have a wedding ring. During his student years, Glenn felt a strong attraction towards her. She was not only physically appealing, but they also shared similar views on life, tastes and interests. Their friendly relations swiftly evolved into an awkward romance, a period of his life that Glenn would always remember fondly, without any regrets. Before lunch, Glenn found Helena and asked with an awkward smile, "Why don't we check out the bistro across the street? The food there's great, and there aren't too many of our co-workers there." "I'm all for it." At first their conversation came out kind of awkward. They both mentally revisited their past, reflecting on their previous closeness, and now fate had brought them together again. "I didn't know you worked here too," Helena confessed. "Does that embarrass you? Don't you think we can maintain our distance?" Glenn responded, suddenly flustered. "No, that's not what I meant. I'm pleased to see you. We had a good parting, there's nothing to worry about. We're both professionals, after all." "I thought you'd choose general surgery, but you became a cardiologist. A very respectful profile." Glenn smiled. They spent the remainder of their time sharing stories about their respective family life failures. "I also went through a divorce, if you can call it that," Glenn confessed, hesitant to admit that Alexa had left him. "My daughter is the same age as your Toby. Perhaps we could meet this weekend. Take them for a walk." "That would be nice. The city has changed so much over the years. I hardly recognize the neighborhoods." Helena laughed. "You don't have to worry. You won't get lost with us. Kira is independent and goes to school, to the tutor, and to friends by herself." It took some time to agree on a weekend, but Glenn eagerly anticipated meeting her outside of work. After their first weekend walk, the dynamic between Helena and Glenn at work changed. They tried to maintain a professional distance, but they found themselves drawn to each other like magnets. Even if they happened to cross paths in the corridor, they couldn't help but pause to chat for a few minutes. Soon, the four of them began meeting every weekend, spending almost the entire day together. "Dad, do you like Helena?" whispered Kira into her father's ear as he watched the woman play badminton with Toby. "What makes you say that?" he responded, surprised by his daughter's directness. "Well, you're looking at her in a special way. I've never seen that before." "I guess you're right," Glenn admitted, playfully flicking his finger on his daughter's nose. "Yes, I do like her. How do you feel about that?" he asked cautiously. They had never had such a conversation before. Glenn had resigned himself to a life without romantic love and hadn't thought he could fall again. Kira shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know. There's nothing wrong with that, is there?" "And you won't be jealous of me?" "I like Helena, and I think she looks at you the same way." After their conversation, Glenn felt much better. He had been considering having an important conversation with Helena, but as single parents they both needed to prioritize their children's interests. "How would you feel about meeting alone, without our little gang?" Glenn asked, looking Helena straight in the eyes as they were parting. "You're right. No need to beat around the bush. It's time to admit that this is more than just a friendly outing. We're adults now, she replied with a smile. I like your answer, Glenn responded. Despite their efforts to be discreet, many at the clinic began to notice that they were always arriving for shifts together, exchanging glances. Occasionally, Glenn would place his hand on Helena's waist, and she wouldn't resist.
Hey, you! Are you even going to invite me to the wedding?
Dr. Hammond interjected, trying to get the attention of the couple who were already heading for the exit. Glenn smiled.
How did you know? We're really getting married.
But we still need to decide on a date, Helena added.
That's right, agreed Dr. Hammond and winked. So, I wait an invitation.
Helena and Toby were often guests at Glenn's home. Mrs. Mathis approved of Glenn's choice, describing his beloved as a decent, economical, and loyal woman. And she is also the best cardiac surgeon in the neighbourhood, Toby declared proudly, boasting about his talented mother.
That's very appropriate, little one,
Mrs. Mathis laughed, patting the boy's head.
You must grow up to be as smart as your parents. First, you'll be proud of their accomplishments, and then they'll be proud of yours.
After dinner, Glenn sent Mrs. Mathis off to rest, assuring her that they could handle the kitchen clean-up. Everyone's asleep. It's just us, Helena murmured, embracing her lover from behind.
Don't do that, or I'll break the plate inadvertently, Glenn responded, laughing softly. We need to consider expanding our living space. Do you prefer an apartment or a house? Let's look near the clinic to shorten our commute. And consider the school's location. Oh, more logistics to think about. Well, then, I suggest we keep the ceremony modest.
Glenn turned and kissed his beloved. I love you. You always know my desires, Helena smiled. In a brightly lit banquet hall, adorned with exquisite white flowers, the newlyweds, in the company of their relatives and friends, celebrated this wonderful event. Now, Glenn was certain of his happiness. He knew he could face any adversity with Helena. She would always support him, and he would protect her from any hardship.